So why don't I let folks do a quick introduction so people know who's going to be there here for the Q&A section. For our format today, I'm going to do literally a lightning speed round on Da Vinci for folks that aren't familiar with the project, and then really spend the meat of the hour talking with our members. We've got folks from the provider and payer side and the vendor side, so really expect to get some good thoughts out of these guys today. I've got Sagran Moodley. Sagran, you out there? And you're on mute if you're talking, Sagran. Okay, we're going to give him a minute and I'm going to skip. I've got Hans Bjuitendijk from Cerner. He's our co-chair for our steering committee. Hans, can you do it?
Can you hear me now, Jocelyn?
Yes, go ahead, Sagran. Can you just do a quick intro?
All right. Yes, good morning. Sagran Moodley. I serve as Senior Vice President for United Healthcare Clinical Services Business, and have the distinct privilege and honor to serve as the chair of Da Vinci with my peers. Thank you.
I affectionately refer to Sagran as our spiritual leader as well. This is a high emotional intelligence project, and he's done a great job of moving us forward as a team. Hans, you want to give a quick intro?
Sure. This is Hans Bjuitendijk. I'm a senior director, director with Cerner, interoperability strategy, and am vice chair of the Da Vinci steering committee, and have been involved from the get-go with Sagran and the team. Looking forward to talk today.
Yeah, and Hans is a great example of one of the leaders that we have on the team that cuts across a number of other activities in the industry as well. I'm sure folks are familiar to Hans from an interop perspective. Chuck, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. This is Chuck Jaffe. I'm the CEO of HL7, and I'm delighted with the publication of the final rules, as well as the remarkable opportunity that Da Vinci has provided a community that previously had been at odds. So congratulations to Da Vinci.
Thanks a lot, Chuck. Chuck is also, I believe, in the spirit animal category for us from a Da Vinci standpoint. I have Brian Patty from Rush on the phone as well.
Hi, it's Brian Patty. I'm a CMIO at Rush. I also sit on the Da Vinci Clinical Advisory Council.
Thanks, Brian. And Deepak Sadagopan. I'm going to slaughter your last name, Deepak. Why don't you go ahead?
Hey, can you hear me?
I can. You sound great.
Okay, great. Hi, Deepak Sadagopan, Senior Vice President, Value-Based Care and Informatics, Population Health Informatics for Providence St. Joseph Health. Part of the Da Vinci Operating Committee. I think it's been my pleasure to meet all of you as part of the process. We joined the initiative late last year, and it's been a great learning process. So thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you, everyone.
Awesome, Deepak. Thank you so much. And then Kirk Anderson, who's also one of our steering committee members and founders.
Good morning, everyone. Kirk Anderson. I'm Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at Cambia Health Solutions. As Jocelyn said, a steering committee member on Da Vinci, and been involved with these folks since the beginnings.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. So a couple housekeeping items. So thank you to the One Up Health folks and the Fireball for pulling together this virtual conference and getting us a much larger, I think, audience than we anticipated this week. We've actually been running our planned activities in our Da Vinci booth online for the past day and a half, and we'll continue for another day and a half. So from the One Up Health site, or if you go to HL7's Confluence site directly, you can actually get links to the demos that we're putting on. And I think that that's really important, because I'm gonna flip to actually share my screen. Let's see if I can do this on the first try. You guys let me know when you can see my screen. Can you guys see it?
There you go.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I think it's important to note that, you know, we've been at this for a couple of years. I'm not going to go into all of the history. And I was just talking to Sagran this morning about the fact that I really feel like today we're at an inflection point with the rules dropping on Monday, that essentially, you know, why Da Vinci exists is changing, right? We started with sort of a party of the willing 2 years ago, really trying to figure out, you know, standing on the shoulders of Argonaut, if there was a way for payers and providers to leverage FHIR the way that the providers were leveraging it with the industry to get data out to their patients. Everyone in the founding community understood that there was a lot of opportunity with FHIR, but we really felt like, and I'd say this is a core principle that's flowed through to today, that the power with FHIR wasn't just the flexibility and moving to a modern API, it was harnessing that by creating distinct recipes for specific business problems. And that really is, in essence, what we're using our implementation guides for, is to build these, fit for purpose guides, so that whether you were, in California, or you were in Massachusetts, or you were a national payer or a regional provider, that you would have the ability to use common APIs that really are truly usable for specific business problems that you're trying to solve. And so we fund this, essentially, the building of implementation guides from a community of interested parties with the subject matter experts that know the most about this problem today, paired with the people that know the most about FHIR today. And it's really been, to Chuck's point, a winning combination in our ability to accelerate the build out. And you'll see in the coming slides, and you'll hear from the discussion today, really be able to accelerate our ability to get real world draft standards out into the market at a pace I think we've really surprised ourselves a little in the industry. And in addition to building the implementation guides, we also pair that with sample code reference implementations. So we believe we eat our own dog food first. We understand workflow is really important in making sure that these things are going to be able to be used. We follow the implementation guidance of the FHIR community of bringing things to connectathons and testing them with real world scenarios. And then from a PMO team perspective, we get to work across this really amazing group of thought leaders and help give them the tools and the resources they need to be able to tell the story, bring people on board, and to grow the community. So I'm not going to go through our history today, as I just mentioned, but I think it's always important, we affectionately refer to this as our NASCAR slide, to show people who's involved in the project. When we first started, we thought we'd have 5 to 10, maybe 8 to 10 members to fund us building 1 or 2 use cases. The news about Apple using the Health Kit and JP Morgan and friends entering the healthcare space happened in the month that we were forming the project, and that gave us really great momentum. And we grew immediately to almost 25 members, and over the last 2 years, really putting the brakes on and sort of adding members as they strategically made sense to the project, and really growing the community at large, not having people actually have to pay to join, but just pick up the resources and use them, to over 45 supporting members of DaVinci, and a much larger swath, I would say probably 100 companies that are out there in the market that are actually picking up our implementation guides and starting to use them. And you can see in the left-hand corner, we have strong partnerships within industry with folks like HIMSS, the HL7 team. For people that don't know DaVinci, we are a privately funded project that lives under HL7. And that's incredibly important for the people that are on this page to have a place to come and sit by side with their competitors and be able to have open discussions about what it is that we need to do to fix the industry. And then partnerships around our quality measures with folks like NCQA that are really helping to drive what the next future of quality measurement and quality measurement creation is going to be, in sync with this group of folks. So I'm going to transition quickly just to talk, and I'm not going to talk in a ton of detail about this today. As I mentioned, there are demonstrations that we're recording or still going to happen with deep dives into demos and talks through these specific use cases themselves. Kirk actually did one for us yesterday that was awesome, that tells the story about how do you actually get one of these projects up and running, and the success that he's had with one of his partners in the Northwest. But just to give you it at a glance, sort of when we talk about the type of content, and especially building on Alex's presentation, sort of the places where DaVinci is already hard at work building the implementation guides and the implementation community around these domain topics that CMS has now put into regulation. You can tell that the red boxes were not done by my graphic designer. They were added by me because they're not nearly as pretty, but it gives you an idea of, we've got a heavy touch on the proposed, or the now final rules. It's going to take me a while to reword that in my vocabulary, and that we're well on route. And I think a view that we get a lot, and this is a emerging slide, it's a little busy, but there's a lot of content packed into it. We've created a rubric, not just to talk about where something is in maturity from an HL7 process perspective, but where is it in the real world? Who's picked it up and used it and is actually either in production or approaching getting to production with some of these implementation guides. So we've worked hard sort of around the categories, quality, coverage burden reduction really is around how do we make sure people understand a patient's benefits, specific benefits at the point of service, so that a provider like Brian actually understands what that particular patient's rules are or what their requirements are for their particular health plan that they're signed up for and where they are in that plan year coverage and what's required of them. making that as transparent for the care team as possible so that if and when we need to do prior auth, we make that as seamless and automated as possible. Member access and clinical data exchange really get at that question. I think that was asked at the end of Alex's presentation, which is, beyond the stuff that's in the rule, how are we making it easier to make sure that there are common standard ways to share clinical data between providers and payers, and then payers back to providers, well beyond what's in US CDI today? And how do we do that in a way that is going to make it easy in workflow and tell people really what's important about the information that's being shared? And then there's some utility use cases that are really around sort of, if we're going to share data and we agree to share data, and I'm going to pick on Deepak for a minute. Deepak, how many different formats do you think you give just to decide whether or not you can exchange data with people today?
Oh, that would be a really long answer, but it goes. I cannot tell you how excited I am to see all of this stuff on one slide. I've not seen that before.
So I'm gonna share a little bit of a conversation I had with Deepak's team when we first started the risk-based member contract member identification, which is literally all it is who are we agreeing to exchange data about? Who do we have in this particular contract? One of his team members shared with me that they literally have 60 different formats that they currently produce for all of the different parties that they work with, right? And that's nonsensical. So us being able to create standards in really simple exchanges like that are really high value.
Yeah, right? It would be over 60 different formats, and the methodologies through which they're transmitted include Excel, PDF files, flat file dumps that we get on SFTP servers, and in some cases it's just faxed to us. So it's ridiculous.
Right. Thank you so much. And so with that, one of the things that is going on, and I've put a link to the Confluent site directly, is we're literally demonstrating, and we've pulled together a group of participants from the market, both our members and their partners, to demonstrate all of these use cases end to end. And I'll tell you, it's a little contrived, right? Because we're putting it all in one single hour, but we follow a single patient across a very typical care journey, and we show where putting these guides in place really lifts, connects, or surfaces information that up until now hasn't been available, except for in really, modern secure methodologies, as Deepak was just talking about, like PDF and Excel. So we're really excited about the work. We're, I think, thrilled to pieces. I've been individually starting all my conversations with my Da Vinci counterparts this week with before we talk about anything and how crazy the week is, I'd first like to say congratulations, because I think the recognition of the Da Vinci IGs being mentioned in the rule and the momentum in the industry, I think, goes well beyond just what people are going to require to do for rule, but I think it gives us momentum and the prioritization across maybe people that aren't paying as close attention to this as the Da Vinci members to really start to get traction. I'm going to share just one resource slide for you guys if you want to screenshot this, or just go to the tiny URL there, hl7.me/Da Vinci News. That'll bring you to a landing page that we had created for HIMSS, really updated a lot of our content, and that gives you a good launch point to get out to a summary of the use cases, put your hands on the implementation guides themselves, find out when calls are happening, link out to those reference implementations that I was discussing, and really start to dive in. Because I think if you hear one thing from us today as we're talking as a group, and I think that the conversation should be pretty good spirited, I think that this is real. We're really excited about it, and we need other people to come and play. I'll before I pitch off sort of to the group itself, I think that often one of the things we talk about is the technology not necessarily being the hard part. It's really finding a provider, a payer with their vendor, whether it's the EHR or another third-party vendor or vendors they're using for a specific use case at a point in time in their business relationship that they're actually have agreed to exchange this data, so that the business process and changes that need to happen inside of an individual organization are underway to support the first of these projects. Because I think once you do the first, it gets a lot easier. So with that, I'm going to flip over to questions. My first question is actually going to be to some of my founding members. When you think about us gathering, back at HL7 and over Christmas break in late in 2017, what do you think made you think that this was the time that we could actually get this done, and what was different today and what was happening today that would make this possible compared to other efforts to really move towards interoperability? And I'll throw it out to Sagran first.
I thought we had an agreement. Chuck gets all the tough answers, and Chuck gets all the tough questions. Now I get all the easy ones. you're not following our policy here. But thank you, first of all. It's a very, we're in a very interesting intersection. Just a couple of perspectives, if you don't mind. But when it comes to healthcare, if you've been following or watching any of our Democratic primary debates and campaigns, while the perspectives on healthcare is different, there's one consistent theme, and that's to ensure every American gets health insurance, and of course to figure out how to pay for it. And so this unaffordability, if you will, is the biggest catalyst of all. And consumers and policymakers are grappling with this, with the unsustainable healthcare cost trajectory. And for context, when we talk about consumer affordability, average total cost for employee-provided insurance is around $20,000 in 2019 for a family. And so payers are no different. So 3-4 years ago, when we started to think about for payers, this cost trajectory, which is top of mind for payers and for providers, we started thinking about this worsening healthcare and how unsustainable it is. Reform was absolutely essential. In fact, it was the only way you could try to think about this. And so value-based care, no surprise, was, a way to change the narrative between providers and payers. And it's done a lot. In many cases, when we sit down, and I speak from a United lens, we sit down with providers, it's a very different conversation than the very traditional payer-provider conversation about claims payments and denials and prior authorization and NEOAB. And today it's a lot about the things we could do together to address unsustainable costs, how to improve quality. Think of the triple aim, improving per capita cost of healthcare, improving population outcomes, improving patient satisfaction. So I think all of these things together, it's a perfect storm. If you think of unsustainable affordability, if you think about decline in healthcare, life expectancy declines, it's a trend that's the worst we've ever seen since World War I. U.S. global scorecard is lacking behind the rest of the world, rising cost trends. You look at opioid, now COVID. And so you look at this worsening in healthcare, you look at affordability, a lack of affordability, and you look at the need for delivery system reform to really drive this forward. Fortunately, Da Vinci got ahead of some of these use cases for the purpose of value-based care, but it ceded to maybe the more overarching pressure points that we face as an industry.
Hans, can you take a pass from your perspective as one of our EHR founding members, sort of the push to say this is a place where we need to go and spend time?
Sure, I think I can continue where Sagran started, connecting with EHRs to get access to patients on the data. Otherwise, you look at the technology part of it is at the same point in time getting to a point where a number of the use cases that have been attempted in the past to work with, to interact data, have either been very much point-to-point or that based on technology did not quite make it work. But now we are working with new tools, new capabilities that enable us to integrate in ways that we couldn't before, or that make it easier to integrate. Work with smaller data sets where it needed. If you look at prior authorization, some of the interactions back and forth. If you look at some of the other use cases that we're talking about. So I think at the same point in time that business drivers and clinical drivers are getting us to a point where we need to do this, that technology and standards are getting us to a point where we can start to do this. And with the work that from an EHR perspective, the different members that you see on the list, including ourselves and also others, is that we have started to work in that space. We started to see that we can make some good progress in that space. So the time is right, and the opportunity is there. Still a lot of work to be done. It's not something that we just turn on a switch and it's there. But the timing is right to move this forward, and that's why we have been interested from the get-go to participate in it, and help to move this forward and improve on it and make it easier. That rather than and which we still will do where we need to, but rather than having to have point-to-point individualized solutions, we can scale this and move this around much better if we do that consistently. And Vinci helps us get to that point, as evidenced by the different use cases, and work with the different parties to make it happen in a great collaborative environment. So I think the time is right from a technology perspective as well, that we can start to do this.
Kirk, do you want to give some thoughts from the Cambia side? I know you guys were heavily invested in FHIR, I think ahead of a lot of the payers in the industry, and sort of, the move and the effort to pull yourself and your colleagues at the Blues to join.
Sure. Yeah, and you mentioned that first meeting back whenever it was. My memory was after that first meeting, I wasn't sure it was going to happen, but I think we quickly, as Sagran mentioned, the payers sitting around the table as we were first sort of envisioning what this idea of Da Vinci could become, realized that a lot of the problems that we were trying to solve individually with our provider partners really didn't need to be solved individually, and that if we could put our efforts and our focus and our resources into finding common ways that we can do this, that the whole ecosystem would benefit. And I think, you mentioned Argonaut as a blueprint. I think it was certainly from a technology perspective, but I think it was also a blueprint for us to see how entities like Cerner or Epic or others who compete very aggressively in the market were able to see the value of collaborating at a basic level for the benefit of everyone. So for us, you asked about our experience with specific provider partners. I think this also kind of ties back to why we are seeing the momentum so much right now. Hans already talked about how the technology side has advanced enough such that it's possible for us. But I think really the key thing for us was this idea of, as we moved into value-based arrangements with our providers, we now had shared pain points. We had shared problems that we needed to collaborate on in order to solve. And that's very different than the old days when the providers sort of had their problems and we had ours. This move kind of forced us really into sitting down and with these new tools, these new capabilities, reimagining how we could do business process workflow in a more efficient way. And so, our experience as we reached out to those first provider partners, it was not a hard sell at all. They got it. I mean, we pretty much just had to say, hey, we've got an idea to do medication reconciliation process better. That was all they needed to hear, because it is such a pain point for them that they were eager to dive in from the get-go.
That's great. And I'd love to actually pull Brian into the conversation. So Brian volunteered to sub in for us for Shafiq last week, who generally gets on the phone and says something very weighty and meaningful. So the pressure is on, Brian. But I think it's, I think Rush and also Deepak at Providence St. Joseph are unique in the situation that you guys really are driving a lot of your own technology strategy yourself. You're building out, your FHIR services ahead of your EHR provider, serving them up or things being fully baked. So can you talk a little bit about why Da Vinci and your participation? And I'm going to tell you guys, the Rush team is awesome. They show up at our Connect-a-thons and just kick butt. Why it's important to you guys as you really work to, to really make not just value-based contracting, but really workflow and burden reduction happen inside the walls at Rush?
Yeah, so I could go down any one of those paths, but let me just start with the burnout path, because that's one of the things that I'm deeply passionate about. Anybody that follows me knows that's something I've been working on for years. One of the big things when you look at burnout, there's obviously for physician burnout, it's a multifactorial problem, but one of the big problems is the administrative tasks in the EHR. The more we can reduce those and get the physician spending more time with their patients and less time with the computer and all of those other administrative tasks, the better care they're going to deliver. That's been shown. The less burnt out a physician is, the better the quality of care they deliver. But the happier the patients are, and quite frankly, then the better the patients are going to comply with their treatments, and the better the outcomes are going to be. So ultimately, this is all about better outcomes for patients and decreasing the cost curve. So let's just take one process, if you don't mind. I'm going to walk through just one process, the way it works today, and the way it will work when all of the pieces in Da Vinci are plugged in and working. So let's take a provider decides to start a patient on a new medication. There is no way in the current world really for that provider to quickly and easily determine if that medication is covered by their payer. There's processes that they could go through. When you consider that the entire visit for a patient is 20 minutes, 20 minutes would be taken by that provider just figuring out accurately if that medication is covered and how much the patient would pay for it. So the physician prescribes the medication for a patient, and in today's world, they could e-prescribe that to the pharmacy. The pharmacy then gets that medication, and that's when typically the benefits check happens in today's world. So the patient leaves the office, goes to the pharmacy, and now the pharmacy's done a benefits check and finds out that the medication is not covered. So the pharmacist says, hey, listen, this medication, if we're covered, just your $30 copay, but it's not covered by your insurer, and so therefore it's $230. Let's just say that. So best case scenario, the pharmacy now calls back to the physician and says, hey, listen, we need to change the medication. Here's what's covered. Is that okay? The physician is now completely out of that workflow. They do a 180 from the patient that they're currently caring for, relook up the patient that this call from the pharmacy is about, decide that medication is okay, and go ahead and prescribe it. And now that patient gets that medication. Worst case scenario, the patient says, forget it, I can't afford that, I'm not taking this medication, and walks out. And guess what? Treatment's not effective if the patient's not taking the treatment, since that patient doesn't get better. In the new world, all of those things, when we plug and play all of these pieces that Da Vinci's working on, that all happens real time as soon as that provider even looks at the medication. So a coverage check happens, and patients say, okay, this patient is covered by insurer A, let's say they're covered by United. Now I can check that patient's benefits. I can check it against the formulary for that patient's coverage. And now I can find out not only what medications are covered, but what the cost to the patient will be right in my prescribing workflow. And now I know I can tell the patient, hey, listen, I'm going to prescribe this new medication. Here's the benefit to you, and here's the cost. It's going to cost you, it will be $30 for your copay. And the patient says, I can do that. And now the patient leaves, goes to the pharmacy. All that's been done. The patient's on the right medication. They're covered. They actually get the medication and start their treatment. And now everybody's happy. The physician spent almost zero time doing all of that checking. The patient gets the medication that's covered, and they actually take it. Patient gets better. Cost of care, overall cost of care to that patient goes way down because they get better. So that's a scenario now that, that was about 4 different pieces of Da Vinci right in that scenario that now work real time rather than a 2 or 3 delay. And in best case scenario, the patient starts taking the medication 2 or 3 days down the line in the current world, or not at all. So that's what I see Da Vinci doing in the real world, which is just exciting.
Thanks, Brian. And Brian's been a huge help. Long before we recruited him to be on the Clinical Advisory Council, he's jumped in and helped do the scenarios and demos and really advocate for us and come and present on Da Vinci's behalf. So thanks, Brian. I think that raises a good point, right? Which is a lot of this stuff happens today, but things fall down in between. Deepak, I'd love to get your thought. You, in our prep conversation for one of our other sessions, you had done this really great talk about sort of like you can make it work with today's state, but really, you know, how do you see FHIR and the work that we're doing on Da Vinci starting to elevate and make this more accessible for the folks like you that don't necessarily have the investment or the teams to do it homegrown?
Yeah, hey, thank you. And I want to say, to Brian's use case earlier, I think that resonates. You know, if you're like Brian or myself working as part of a provider organization, part of a delivery system, really responsible for outcomes, for a large set of population, then you are worried about how provider burnout is like on top of everybody's mind right now, and minimizing the administrative time that is creeping up and is really taken a significant chunk of the caregiver's time these days. So I think very, very excited to kind of see the transition and the new opportunities coming to kind of use technology behind the scenes to reduce that. I would also say, Jocelyn, to our earlier conversation, that the improving exchange of data, in many cases, like if you take prior authorization as an example, or even the medication reconciliation example, there are ways to accomplish some of these clinical data exchanges today, using existing standards. If there are, even with, it may not be as efficient or scalable as FHIR, but there are at least existing standards, that can facilitate some of these interoperability transactions. I would like to point your attention to another area where there is no standards at this point and there's no guidance. And that's like, if you're a provider organization like us and you are basically, and the industry is shifting to value-based care, what's really happening is, just as an example, just within the Washington state, and our organization covers 7 states. We have easily over 150, if you count unique value-based contracts across the system. And we've got over 1.7 million covered lives across those value-based arrangements. And the challenge is that every agreement is a little bit different. The populations are covered a little bit different. The quality measures that govern outcome are different. How we receive information from our payers is different. And even with everything that we've talked about today with FHIR, the interoperability standards that are being discussed are at a patient level. It's about a patient medication reconciliation. You talk about, whether it's about exchange of ECDI, it's still at a patient level, right? The payment models and the value-based reimbursement methodologies are shifting to population-based outcomes. There's no vocabulary outside of maybe the clinical quality measure track of work that we've talked about that are in the works or have gotten any attention across the industry to actually focus on populations as a whole. And the challenge that creates is that for providers like us, now we've got to deal with, how do we know which members are even covered under a population? We don't even know that until like maybe 6 months after a contract's actually started. We don't know the way we get told about how we are performing under a particular contract. There's no standard to that. That's like PDF documents. We've got a whole team that's actually reviewing PDF documents on a quarterly basis, looking at performance statements and actually manually entering that digitally into the space. So as the concept of revenue cycle as we know it transitions into a value-based care space, we need to take a step back and really rethink how business and administrative operations will work in a value-based care world. Because I can tell you right now, the current state of affairs is not scalable.
So I'm going to pitch that over to Kirk, because I think one of the things that we've seen is we talk a lot about sort of there's like a heat map or a footprint within the country of people starting to move towards picking up these IGs and using them. And I think that Cambia, is one of the early adopters out there in the market, has been able to see, sort of once you're ready to engage and work with folks, that they're there. Kirk, can you talk a little bit further about sort of, Deepak's sort of advanced gameplay, right? He's already doing a lot of the fundamental things within his four walls to normalize content. But as we move forward into really scale of communities of people exchanging this data, how do you see things shaping up from where you sit, especially now with the rules dropping?
Yeah, well, I think, there's a couple of points there. I think, as Deepak said, we've had standards for how we structure data in healthcare for a long time, and particularly how we structure it at rest. What's new here is standardizing the way that we can exchange that data in a way that is internet friendly and that allows us to create these distributed business processes. This is the use of APIs. So that has never been standardized. So where in the past, yes, we could build APIs and innovate with a particular provider to move us from, instead of sending us the Excel spreadsheet that Deepak mentioned, why don't you send it to us in real time through an API? When we pivoted to the next provider to take advantage of that, we would start from scratch. Or that next provider or the next payer, if you want to think of it in the other direction, may have bought a tool that would support the exchange of data via an API. But providers don't want to interact with 50 different tools with 50 different proprietary APIs. So this is different than the standards that we've had in healthcare for a long time, because it is allowing those distributed business processes that we don't have to reinvent with each provider. I think, the point about moving into population health, that's definitely a critical focus area, and it's an area that Da Vinci itself is leaning into. One of the first use cases that Cambia is creating the implementation guide for is this idea of the risk-based member identification, or that member roster, which is very foundational to set the scope, basically set the where statement for all of the questions and transactions that we want to do with a provider. We need to first know, well, who are we talking about? And what's important about the work that we are doing in that particular use case is it's also allowing us to incorporate and exercise bulk FHIR, which is a relatively new standard that will allow us to send population data. So it's not just about individual member level data like we talk about in the case of a prior auth, but being able to send, going in one direction, a member roster in bulk that says these are the 500 people we're talking about, and to be able to get back clinical data exchange for those 500 individuals as part of a single conversation between API endpoints. That's a great leap forward in managing value-based arrangements. So it's coming. It's just we're at the early stages of that, like all the rest of this.
Sagran, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, so we step back and you just think about maybe from a very simplistic view. It was simple. As payers were trying to advance interoperability with their health system partners and providers, the one thing we heard consistently was, we don't want to do it in a unique way with you, United Healthcare. And then tomorrow, we're going to figure out how to do it with payer number 2 and number 3 and number 4. And so it became really, really well. We were trying to really push into this white space of advancing interoperability. And you could see very clearly, I talked about ACOs earlier. We would talk to many health systems who were not at risk. And yes, there was a need for data, but it was more of an underlying enabler and a need than it was a business imperative. And suddenly they go at risk, and they very the heightened sensitivity about we need inpatient data. In fact, payers, we need claims data from you because we want to understand where the leakage is. We want to understand our utilization. We want to understand trends. And so as we sat with them and said, well, here's how we could do this, ABC, it was clear. We're not going to do it as a once-off. And in fact, we didn't want to do it as a once-off when we went to the large national health systems and we had to do this from scratch. And every conversation was a clean whiteboard conversation. Here's all the tools in the toolbox. And thanks to Chuck and VHL7, they create a lot of tools for us to go and effectuate these new interoperability models. But we didn't want to have a whiteboard conversation, plain whiteboard conversation every time. And so these railway lines or these IGs or blueprints from Da Vinci was a very simplistic way to say, well, we all solving for data exchange for quality measures. We also are trying to solve. There isn't a payer today that is not trying to solve prior authorization. We all are. In fact, we have been. But the health system, the doc don't want to have a 10 o'clock patient for United and do prior authorization one way, and his 11 o'clock patient for Humana is prior auth another way, and his 12 o'clock patient for Cambia is prior auth another way. And so we had to gravitate to a payer-agnostic, health system-agnostic approach that was repeatable, that was consistent, and could evolve with the emerging market policy standards, right? So Chuck, maybe that's a good tee up for you because, first of all, congrats to you as well. I think it was just hearing that FHIR Release 4 is now, it's where it is today. It's just phenomenal. So thank you for you and HL7 for all the great work. But you want to weigh in on that last point about building on the good work of standards to drive to reuse and blueprints?
We have 1 minute, so I'll be brief.
Oh, no, Chuck, we actually have until quarter till, just so you know.
Oh, congratulations.
You got to take your time.
The opportunity that was afforded in 2017 with our Partners in Interoperability program was just the beginning of the excitement that developed around the payer community. I think more of the organizations really had a change in mindset as much as an adoption of a technology which was not fully understood by all of them. The key element here was that organizations that had not partnered in the past, patient, provider, insurers, really could not have been imagined only a year earlier. Da Vinci set a new standard for bringing together organizations that really had been adverse, if not never eager to share information. The balance of this falls now under a much larger umbrella that we call the FHIR Accelerator Program. It's really an exciting opportunity to have single-minded individuals with specific needs partner under a program to develop their specific goals using FHIR. The first of these, of course, was Argonaut. Early on, Da Vinci provided a remarkable example of FHIR acceleration. It's not about increasing the standards, it's about increasing the implementation of the FHIR standard within a broad community. It reduces the risk of duplicative implementations. It energizes like-minded people to work collaboratively on filling gaps and advancing basic needs. As this grew to include the Karen Alliance around payer-patient data exchange, Codex in a unique oncology initiative, and Gravity around social determinants of health, the landscape broadened significantly. And so what was needed was an opportunity for the various FHIR accelerators to share best practices, to utilize some of the implementation guides and remarkable technical capabilities that they had developed on their own, because the overlap was significant. Now, as we bring in other FHIR accelerators to be partners in this process, we'll see even more sharing, more focus on the commonality amongst the different FHIR accelerators. Certainly, the research program that is emerging will integrate nicely with the population health initiative that will come later in the year. I think all of them will learn from the experiences of Argonaut and will be able to leverage the work of Da Vinci in the creation of their own implementation guides, but reuse some of the valuable technical accomplishments. Lastly, I believe this is more about people than it is about technology. And ultimately, it's about working together to achieve the goal of better patient care, easing the complex demands in the clinical community, and reducing the spiraling cost of healthcare. And I think Da Vinci can lead the way amongst the FHIR accelerators for establishing that precedent. So congratulations to Da Vinci, and thanks to Jocelyn.
Hey, thanks a lot, Chuck. And I think that we are at an inflection point as an industry, and I think you touched on that greatly. And I think that we've sort of gone past that, I think, as a group, but this idea of how payers and providers relationships are intrinsically changing for value-based care and in participation in projects like Da Vinci. And there's a number of other opportunities. So definitely check out the HL7 website and figure out if we're not talking about problems you're trying to solve. I'm sure there's an accelerator out there that is. I think that we've got about 10 minutes left. I'd like to preserve a little bit of time. So I'm going to ask, and I may run into issues doing this, but I'm going to ask maybe for a lightning round. I think that if we can get maybe thoughts from each of you guys in a couple words of, what barriers do you think are there that we need to get over? And, who would have imagined today that we'd be streaming out on YouTube and not sitting at HIMSS when we started this adventure back in September to get ready for HIMSS? What's your call to action to the people that are listening to us or that are going to listen to a recording of this? What do you want people to do when they get off the phone? So barriers and what do you want people to do next? And I'll go through in reverse order. Kirk, why don't you go first?
All right. Thank you, Jocelyn. I'll say, as far as what I would advise folks to do next, and in particular to payers, now that we have the rules from CMS, no better time than to start to look at what the Da Vinci project is producing in the form of its implementation guides. There are Da Vinci use cases that are specifically created to help payers comply with these new rules. And with putting your focus on those, and you should have, now that we have the compliance stick, thanks to CMS, you should have all the priority and all the funding that you need to deliver on those use cases. And I think what you're going to find is by taking that first step, non-discretionary now, you're going to see the reusability of some of these technical building blocks to pivot and use them now not for compliance value, but for real business value in your value-based arrangements with providers. So that's my call to action.
Deepak, you're next.
Yeah. Hey, thank you. First, I'll say that super excited to work with this community at DaVinci. I think we started pretty late, late into last year. I think when we first in 2018 when we started joining the initiative, and we're very excited to be part of this group. Second, I'd say that I think my advice for reflection, especially in those on the provider side of the house listening to this, would be to reflect on capabilities that on two aspects, not only as it relates to efficiency, as it relates to reducing administrative burden at the point of care and for patient care, but also recognize that the broader business of value-based care and what it takes to really scale this movement from fee-for-service to value-based models, right? And all the barriers that you encounter in those spaces. And I think from a Providence perspective, I would say that the internal aspects of actually contributing to this movement forward is really internal preparedness, right? And really getting up to speed on FHIR, building up the internal capabilities, not only to exchanging information in a new paradigm with other providers, but with payers going forward. And second would be to really contribute from our experience of operational experience in scaling value-based care and the challenges that we encounter, bringing the type of use cases that need to be addressed and prioritized. And Jocelyn, as you well know, that we're not shy about putting those use cases on the table. So we will continue to do that, and we will seek out partners within the DaVinci community and others to kind of take us up on that and really focus in on those use cases in the interest of scaling value-based care across the country. So.
That's awesome. And Kirk's going to teach you what it's like to pay for your own use case so you can get it done. We'll have that offline conversation later. I don't think you've been around long enough for you to understand the true meaning of being voluntold for something. So I'm going to go to Brian Patty, and Brian is familiar with that term thoroughly. So
yes. So I mean, I have to echo what Deepak said. I mean, if you're a provider and you're worried about administrative burden on your physicians, really pay attention to what's going on at DaVinci and look at those use cases and see that the burden that you can lift from your providers, but also looking at overall cost of care to really bend the cost curve and to improve the care of the populations of patients that we're serving. You really have to have that close collaboration between payers, providers, and the vendors at the table, all working together like we are in DaVinci, and solving these issues and getting data that's needed to care for patients into the workflows real time, whether it's in the provider workflow or in the payer workflow or in the pharmacist workflow, wherever that patient's interacting with the system, the data that's needed to make good decisions on that patient is available real time. And that's really what DaVinci is all about. I think of DaVinci, I think of FHIR kind of like as Bluetooth for healthcare. If you have a Bluetooth device and you have another Bluetooth device, you know those two are going to connect. They just do. It just works. And that's what FHIR does for healthcare. FHIR is really about, if I'm FHIR enabled and you're FHIR enabled, I know because of the standards that exist that we can exchange the data that we need to exchange. And what we're doing at DaVinci is really building out those use cases so that the people that follow us can come in and say, I want to use, they can come off the shelf and say, I want to use that one, and that one. And they know they can get those to work because they're FHIR enabled.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Chuck, to you.
Yeah, I think there's a different outlook that we should consider. There are advances in DaVinci that need to be accomplished before we can claim success. There are certainly improvements in FHIR that will need to develop. R5 will certainly address some of them, but not all of them. I can envision R7 or R10 being a more complete package for the industry and for interoperability. What I can do is I can encourage people to participate in the process, either as a developer or as an implementer, to take part in it and to bring your skill sets and knowledge to bear, rather than simply producing commentary on the work of others. I think the opportunity is ripe now for a great many individuals and organizations to get on board. So Da Vinci is just beginning its journey. Take part in it.
I'm going to do a check-in with the One Help folks just before I continue on to Hans and Sagran. Do we have time to take a couple questions and let these guys answer that last question?
Yeah, let's have Sagran talk, and then we have some questions from YouTube that I'll deal with after Sagran.
Oh, I think we've just been put on hold. Oh, maybe not.
Are we there?
Go ahead, Sagran.
Go ahead,
That was
Sagran.
great. You know, thank you for the question. This is always the most important question. There's still some music in the back. Oh, it's gone. So I think about the 3 C's: courage, commitment, and contribution. And let me talk maybe quickly about it. First of all, courage. We apply traditional thinking to solving some of these new problems. We would have got a better taxi system, maybe more taxis, cleaner taxis, as opposed to Uber. And you've got to have the courage to do what's not being done. And I really take my hat off to the Da Vinci founding team, many of those who were around the table when we said we can get all Da Vinci participants to agree to the same agreement. And we would have faith, commitment, and courage to get into this, knowing that this is needed, that this is gonna do what's never been done before. So courage is important. Second, commitment. Consumer fear and lack of consumer confidence is creating unfortunate negative pressure on the markets. And enterprises are going to be forced to make tough decisions. Do they stay vested in some of the standards development, or do they reprioritize their focus? The mandate's absolutely going to create some anxiety. So I ask that participants, members, community partners reach out to us to help you with understanding what Da Vinci is, help educate your leaders, help them understand why it's important to still remain committed and vested in it. And contribution. This standards work, and I learn a lot about it from my peers on this call. It's tough. It is absolutely tough. But what I also learned about it, it's public domain, and that everybody has a voice. And the only way you can really come and participate and really weigh in and help make this a success is by rolling up your sleeves, getting into the trenches, get your teams involved, and really help us advance this work. And last but not least, we need pilots. If we have the railway lines, if we have the IGs, and we have the standards, we need to demonstrate that there's a there, and we can only advance it if we really put it to work. So thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to continuing working with the community on this work.
Awesome. Thanks, Sagran. And Hans, did you want to add one point?
Yeah, just as we have talked about it, and you started this last lightning round with a statement of, well, what are any barriers that are out there? I don't think there are barriers per se. There are challenges, opportunities, and I think with what we're also seeing with the way that the Da Vinci guidance is being developed, the use of FHIR, we might find that, yeah, maybe not everybody is aligned yet on the same set of APIs. Everybody is working with their client set, with their provider community, with their environment on what APIs to expose first, second, third, and that is rapidly evolving, and we have different requirements out there. But we also see that based on the capabilities, we have opportunities to be flexible. You can use smart apps to bridge gaps. If you look at prior authorization, there are opportunities to either directly integrate into your workflow, or you use a smart app in between to bridge the gap. So I think we should look in terms of opportunities we have with the building blocks, how we can puzzle them together, get a step forward and move forward, and not necessarily believe that everything all needs to be done at one point in time to get there. So I think it's more a question of challenges and opportunities rather than barriers.
And Doug, I'm painfully aware of the fact that we are between other people and Dr. Don Rucker speaking. So I just want to do one quick plug. I put back up on the screen. We'll be doing demonstrations and deep dives into Da Vinci over the next day and a half. I recommend folks go to our calendar directly, and that will give you a great path to go and get the resources that we are discussing today. And I'd love to thank you for the opportunity. If you want, we can definitely stick around for a couple questions while you get Dr. Rucker situated, and we'll go there.
Yeah, let's stick around for a couple questions. So one question from Umar Najib. When do you expect FHIR bulk data to become available to identify, enroll cohorts of patients onto studies or retrieve associated data with a disease registry, which can be used for multiple purposes?
Do we want to take that from two bents? Kirk, do you want to talk about the risk-based member identification IG you're building? And then maybe Chuck can talk about the emerging accelerator in that area.
Sure. Yeah, so this, the risk, thanks for the, I took Hans's pro tip. Now coming to you from the banks of the Sandy River. So the risk-based member identification use case that sometimes we just call member roster, we're actively developing that one as we speak with our partner Multicare and also with another partner, Ochin. So we're in testing stages of this. So I think this is something that we want to make available as a finalized implementation guide with some practical use of it, certainly this year. I would imagine this summer we'll be starting to improve the ways we are exchanging those rosters with our provider partners.
Chuck, you want to dive in?
Sure. From a technology perspective, FHIR bulk data is being developed in partnership with HL7 at Boston Children's Hospital. Some of the FHIR bulk data specifications are in the balloting process, and some are being tested now. I think there's an important opportunity here, which is to become part of the implementation environment where bulk data is utilized to make really important decisions, whether it's risk-based analysis, evaluation of genomic data, or clearly clinical care. And so at the heart of this is an implementation community's capability of utilizing the existing standard and driving it to both adoption and the next release.
Do you want to go to another question, Ricky, or have us wrap up?
No, I think we can wrap up now. Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. Come find us, come and help participate, folks. We're super excited, and hats off to OneUp for pulling this together today and getting us to a great audience. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you all for attending, and we look forward to reconnecting afterwards.